When people think of ancient Egypt, they picture golden tombs, powerful pharaohs, and a land blessed by the Nile. But here's the harsh truth. If you were born a farmer, your life was far from glorious. In fact, it sucked. Behind the pyramids and temples we admire today stood millions of ordinary people trapped in endless labor. Farmers weren't just feeding their families, they were feeding the entire kingdom while barely surviving themselves. This wasn't a life of opportunity or prosperity. It was backbreaking work, heavy taxes, constant risk of starvation, and absolutely no way out. Being born a farmer in ancient Egypt meant your destiny was written before you could even walk. And the grind started with something no one could escape, the daily battle with the land itself. For the farming class of ancient Egypt, life wasn't defined by years or accomplishments. It was defined by the next sunrise. Each morning, the day began before the heat fully settled in, with men, women, and even children heading out to the fields. There were no schedules, no choice, no days off. Work was simply the air they breathed. The tasks were endless and unforgiving. Irrigation trenches had to be dug and cleared constantly, since even a small blockage could ruin an entire plot of land. Seeds had to be sown by hand, step after step, bent over for hours at a time, often with children scattering them alongside parents. Harvesting was no less brutal, bending, cutting, binding stalks together, and carrying heavy bundles across fields, with no carts or animals to make the job easier. Farmers relied on crude, heavy tools. A wooden plow dragged by oxen might sound like help, but it only tore the soil in small strips, and pushing it through the earth was exhausting. Sickles, sometimes tipped with bronze, dulled quickly, forcing constant sharpening. The simplest of jobs, like carrying water, meant hauling clay jars that could weigh as much as a child, walking them back and forth in the relentless heat until your arms burned. And the environment itself seemed to conspire against them. Egypt's sun didn't just shine, it scorched. Hours under its glare could blister skin and leave workers dizzy with heat stroke. Sandstorms blew in without warning, choking the air and covering crops in dust. Nights weren't restful either. Farmers spent them grinding grain, baking bread, repairing tools, and preparing for the next sunrise. It was a cycle with no escape. There were no weekends, no guaranteed rest days, and no real reward. Even when crops thrived, it didn't guarantee security, because nature had the final say, and every farmer knew their survival depended on a river that could just as easily destroy as it could sustain. Which brings us to the biggest myth of all, that the Nile was always a blessing. For farmers, it was just as much a curse. The Nile is often remembered as Egypt's eternal gift, the river that brought life to the desert. But to the farmers who lived by it, the Nile was a gamble they could never walk away from. Every year, farmers waited for the river's flood. If it rose at just the right level, it spread across the fields, leaving behind a layer of rich, dark silt. That fertile soil was their only chance to grow enough food to keep Egypt alive. But the Nile wasn't consistent. Some years the water came too low, the river shrank, the soil stayed dry, and crops withered before they could even sprout. Those years meant famine. Other times, the river rose too high, swallowing entire fields, washing away seeds, drowning animals, and even collapsing mud brick homes built too close to the banks. Those years meant devastation. Farmers bore all the risk. They had no say, no safety net, and no power to change what the river decided. Yet when harvests failed, it wasn't the pharaoh or the priests who went hungry. It was the farming families. Pharaohs declared that poor floods were punishments from the gods, but the temples still received their offerings, and the palaces still held banquets. The burden always fell on the people at the bottom, and the Nile demanded constant attention, even in good years. Irrigation canals needed digging and maintenance to control the flow of water. If you didn't work fast enough, the water either dried up before reaching the fields or flooded in too strongly, destroying the crops. Imagine spending weeks digging trenches under the sun, knowing that if you miscalculated by even a little, months of labor would vanish overnight. The Nile was never just a river. For farmers, it was a reminder that survival was always at the mercy of nature. Every season was a gamble, feast or famine, prosperity or starvation. And while the elites praised the Nile as a symbol of divine favor, farmers knew the truth. The river was as cruel as it was generous. But no matter how harsh the floods, one thing never changed. The pharaoh's tax collectors still came knocking, demanding their share. As if the crushing labor and the Nile's unpredictability weren't enough, farmers lived under another shadow, the pharaoh's tax system. Egypt's prosperity didn't just come from its monuments or trade, it came from squeezing every last drop of work and grain out of the farming class. Tax collectors, known as scribes and officials, roamed the villages during harvest. They weren't kindly accountants. They were enforcers. Armed with authority, backed by soldiers, they demanded grain, barley, flax, or whatever crops were owed to the state. And these demands didn't change, even in years when the Nile failed and crops collapsed. Whether your field was overflowing or barren, the tax quota stayed the same. If you couldn't meet the quota, the punishment was swift. Officials recorded your shortfall, and consequences followed. Public beatings, humiliation, or the confiscation of what little you had left. Farmers weren't just taxed in grain either. When food ran short, the pharaoh demanded something even more draining: their labor. This was the dreaded corvée, a system of forced service. Farmers were pulled away from their families and sent to dig canals, build roads, or even haul massive stones for temples and monuments that glorified rulers who would never know their names. These projects could last weeks, months, even years, leaving families back home to fend for themselves with fewer hands in the fields. And here's the bitter truth: the tax system was designed not for fairness, but for control. Pharaohs ensured that farmers stayed tied to the land, forever indebted, forever working. The grain went to fill royal granaries, feed soldiers, supply temples, and secure trade, while the people who produced it barely had enough left to survive. And all this suffering bought farmers nothing in return: no recognition, no honor, and no chance to rise above their station. Because in the eyes of Egyptian society, farmers were stuck at the very bottom of the pyramid. Despite forming the majority of the population and keeping the entire kingdom alive, farmers had almost no respect in ancient Egypt. They weren't slaves in chains, but they weren't free in any real sense either. Their destiny was sealed at birth. Born a farmer, die a farmer. The social pyramid of Egypt was brutally rigid. At the very top stood the pharaoh, a living god. Below him, priests controlled religion, scribes controlled knowledge, and soldiers earned honor through battle. Even artisans and craftsmen had skills that brought them recognition. But farmers, they were invisible, the foundation of the kingdom, yet treated as disposable. To the elite, a farmer wasn't a person with ambitions or dreams. He was a pair of hands, a back to carry loads, a body to toil in the fields. The idea of education, of rising in status, of breaking free from that cycle, it simply didn't exist for them. Literacy was reserved for scribes, politics for nobles, and religious authority for priests. Farmers were locked out of every path upward, and the injustice cut deeper during hard times. When famine hit, the granaries of the elite stayed full while farming families starved. Pharaohs and priests praised the gods, dined in luxury, and continued their rituals, while the very people who had made their feasts possible suffered in silence. Even in death, the contrast was cruel. Nobles were embalmed, wrapped in fine linens, and buried in tombs that still draw tourists thousands of years later. Farmers were buried quickly in shallow graves, often nameless, forgotten before the next flood. Their labor built Egypt's temples, fed its armies, and filled its treasuries. Yet their existence left almost no trace in history, and that invisibility, that erasure, was perhaps the harshest insult of all. But as humiliating as their low status was, daily life held one final, bitter twist. The food they worked so hard to produce was food they rarely got to eat themselves. Here's one of the most frustrating parts about being a farmer in ancient Egypt. You grew the food, but you didn't get to enjoy it. The rich feasted on roasted duck, beef, honey, and sweet fruits, luxuries pulled straight from the labor of the fields. Meanwhile, the farmers who made all of this possible survived on the bare minimum. A typical farmer's diet was simple and repetitive: coarse bread, onions, and beer. Meat was rare, almost a festival-only treat. Most families couldn't dream of tasting the foods they saw carted away from their harvests to feed nobles and temples. And the irony ran even deeper. After taxes, many farmers barely had enough grain left to keep their own households alive. They watched their hard work fill the granaries of the elite, while their children went hungry. Bread was sometimes stretched with sand or grit from grinding stones, wearing down teeth and causing pain that most never had treated. So while Egypt's rulers dined like kings, literally, the very people who sustained the kingdom often ate worse than their animals. It was a daily reminder that no matter how hard they worked, farmers lived only to keep others comfortable. But poor diets weren't their only problem. The harsh conditions of farm life also exposed them to constant sickness and injury. If endless labor and poor diets weren't enough, Farmers also lived in constant battle with sickness. Working knee-deep in Nile mud exposed them to parasites and waterborne diseases. Mosquitoes carried fevers that swept through entire villages. And without proper medical care, even a small cut from a farming tool could turn deadly. Archaeologists have studied the skeletons of ancient farmers, and the evidence is shocking. Worn-down joints, broken bones that never healed correctly, and teeth ground down to the roots from eating gritty bread. Many lived with chronic pain their entire lives, but there was no escape. Work didn't stop because your back gave out, or because you caught an infection. You pushed through, or you didn't survive. Life expectancy for farmers was brutally short compared to the elite. While nobles were embalmed and remembered in tombs, most farmers died young and were buried in unmarked graves, their names forgotten. Their suffering rarely made it into the history books, even though their sacrifices built the very civilization those books celebrate. So disease, injury, and exhaustion weren't rare exceptions. They were part of everyday life. For farmers, misery was the norm, and health was a privilege only the higher classes could hope for. And when the Nile's cycle slowed and the fields went dry, things got even worse. Farmers faced something even more terrifying than disease: the hunger season. During the Nile's dry season, when water levels dropped and fields lay barren, farmers faced the most terrifying enemy of all: hunger. Crops dwindled, reserves ran thin, and families were forced to ration every crumb of bread. For the elites, granaries filled with stored grain acted like insurance policies. But for farmers, there was nothing to fall back on. A bad season could mean malnutrition, sickness, or worse. Children often suffered first, their growth stunted by the lack of food. Parents sometimes had to beg or borrow just to keep their families alive until the next flood. This cycle of plenty and scarcity never truly ended. Even in the best years, farmers lived with the shadow of starvation hanging over them. And in the worst years, entire communities wasted away while Egypt's rulers carried on with banquets and festivals. And the cruelest part of it all, even if you somehow survived the backbreaking labor, the Nile's unpredictability, the taxes, the sickness, and the hunger, your fate was sealed the moment you were born. The most crushing part of being a farmer in ancient Egypt wasn't just the labor, the taxes, or even the constant hunger. It was the simple fact that there was no escape. If you were born a farmer, you died a farmer. That was your fate. The system was designed to keep people trapped in their roles. Education was reserved for scribes and the elite. Soldiers could sometimes climb the ranks. Priests held spiritual authority, and craftsmen could pass down valuable trades. But farmers? They had no ladder to climb. The cycle was brutally predictable. Your father tilled the land, you tilled the land, and your children would do the same. Even religion reinforced this reality. Pharaohs and priests taught that serving the kingdom through labor was a divine duty. So farmers weren't just bound by law, they were told it was the will of the gods. Questioning it wasn't just dangerous, it was considered sinful. So while pharaohs carved their names into stone, farmers left behind little more than calloused hands and broken bodies. Their work sustained Egypt's glory, but their own stories vanished into the sand. And that's why being born a farmer in ancient Egypt was a curse, not a blessing. The daily grind was relentless. The Nile was unpredictable. The taxes were crushing, and their place in society was unchangeable. They grew the food but rarely ate it. They carried the kingdom, but were forgotten by it. Egypt's greatness wasn't built on gold or gods. It was built on the suffering of millions of farmers whose names we'll never know. So the next time you picture the glory of the pyramids, remember this: behind every stone was a farmer's hand. Behind every feast was a farmer's sacrifice. And behind every triumph was a class of people trapped in lives they never chose. Would you really want to be reborn in glorious ancient Egypt, if it meant being born a farmer?